Scrambled Egg Super by Dr. Seuss. I don't like to brag, and I don't like to boast, said Peter T. Hooper. But speaking of toast, and speaking of kitchens, and ketchup and cake and kettles and stoves, and the stuff people bake, well, I don't like to brag, but I'm telling you, Liz, that speaking of cooks, I'm the best that there is. Why, only last Tuesday, when Mother was out, I really cooked something worth talking about. You see, I was sitting there, resting my legs, when I happened to pick up a couple of eggs, and I sort of got thinking, it's sort of a shame that scrambled eggs always taste the same. And that's because ever since goodness knows when, they've always been made by the eggs of a hen. Just a plain common hen. What a dumb thing to use, with all the other eggs you could possibly choose. And so I decided that just for a change, I'd scramble up a new kind of egg on the range, some fine fancy egg that no other cook cooks, like the eggs of the ruffled-neck solomagooks. A solomagooks, say, they could be good. So I went out and found some as quick as I could. And while I was lugging them back to the house, I happened to notice a tizzle-top grouse in a tree down the street, and I knew from her looks that her egg and the egg of the solomagooks ought to mix mighty well, ought to taste simply super, when scrambled together by Peter T. Hooper. So I took those eggs home, and I frizzled them up, and I added some sugar, 2/3 of a cup, and a small pinch of pepper, and also a pound of horseradish sauce that was sitting around, and also some nuts and I tasted that stuff, and it tasted quite fine, but not quite fine enough. To make the best scramble that's ever been made, a cook has to cook the best egg ever laid. So I drove to the country quite rather far out, and I studied the birds that were flitting about. I looked up with great care at a mop-noodled finch. I looked at a beagle-beaked, bald-headed grinch, and also I looked at the shading roosting quail, who was roosting right under a lasso-look's tail. And I looked at a spritz and a flannel-winged jay, but I just didn't stop. I just kept right on my way, 'cause they didn't have any eggs. They weren't laying that day. Then suddenly, boy, up that hill a short space, birds, they were laying all over the place. Great, happy, gay families and uncles and cousins, all laying fine, strictly fresh eggs by the dozens. Why, I'd have to scramble more super than super. Scramble super de-duper, de-booper, special a la deluxe Peter T. Hooper. I picked out the eggs in the most careful way. I only picked those that I knew were grade A. I only took eggs from the very best fowls, so I took the eggs from the twiddler owls. So I didn't take the eggs from the twiddler owls, 'cause I knew that the eggs from those fellows who twiddle taste sort of like dust from inside a bass fiddle. I went for the kind that were mellow and sweet, and the world's sweetest eggs are the eggs of the queet, which is due to those very sweet trout which they eat. And those trout, well, they're sweet because they only eat wogs, and wogs, after all, are the world's sweetest frogs. And the reason they're sweet is whenever they lunch, they always eat the world's sweetest bees that they munch. And the reason no bees could ever be sweeter than these, they only eat the blossoms of the beezelnut trees, and the beezelnut blossoms are the sweetest, are sweeter than sweet, and that's why I nabbed several eggs from the queet. But I passed up the eggs of a bird called the strudel, who's sort of a stork, but with fur like a poodle. For they say that the eggs of this kind of stork are gooey like glue, and they stick to your fork. And the yolks of these eggs, I am told, taste like fleece. while the whites taste like a very old bicycle grease. The places I biked to, the roads that I rambled, to find the best eggs that have ever been scrambled. I hunted new birds along the wild tangled trails, through gullies and gulches and down dingles and dales. I wrinkled my way and I crawled at a creep through the forest of ferns that was 40 miles deep. And I mushed through the brush till I found a fine quigger whose eggs are as big as a pinhead, no bigger. Then I went for the eggs of a long-legged quong. Now, the quong, she's built a little bit wrong, for her legs are so terribly, terribly long that when she lays eggs 20 feet in the air, they drop with a plop to the ground from up there. So unless you can catch them before the eggs crash, you don't have eggs, you've got long-legged hash. Eggs. I collected 302, but I still needed more, and suddenly I knew that the job was too big for one fellow to do. So I telegraphed north to some friends near Fazol, which is 10 miles or so just beyond the North Pole. And they, all of them, jumped in their catamasside, which is sort of a boat made from sea leopard's hide, which they sailed out to sea to go looking for gryce, which is sort of a bird which lays eggs on the ice, which they grabbed with a tool, which is known as a squitch, 'cause those eggs are too cold to be touched without which. And while they were sending those eggs, I got word of a bird that does something that most never heard of. It's hard to believe, but this bird is called pelf. It lays eggs that are 3 times as big as herself. Now, that pelf ever learned such a difficult trick, I never found out, but I found that egg quick. I managed to get it down from out of the nest and home to the kitchen along with the rest. But I didn't stop then, 'cause I knew of the ducks by the name of the single file Zoomzimian zucks, who stroll single file through the mountains of summer, quite oddly enough, with their eggs on their thumbs. And some fellows in Zums, whom I happen to know, just happened to capture 1,000 or so. And they wrapped up their eggs, and they mailed them by air, marked special delivery, handled with care. I needed more helpers, and so for assistance, I called up a fellow named Allie long distance. And Allie, as soon as he hung up the phone, picked up a small basket and started alone to climb the steep crags and jags of Mount Straku to fetch me the egg of a Mount Straku cuckoo. Now, these Mount Straku cuckoos are rather small gals, but these Mount Straku cuckoos have lots of big pals. They dived from the skies with wild, cackling shrieks, and they jabbed at his legs, and they stabbed at his cheeks with their yammering, clamoring, hammering beaks. But Allie, brave Allie, fought his way through, and he went and he sent me the eggs, as I knew he would do, for my scrambled egg super dee duper dee booper, special deluxe a la Peter T. Hooper. In the meanwhile, of course, I was keeping real busy collecting the eggs of the 3-eyelash tizzy. They're quite hard to teach, so I rode up on the top of a hammock, shenamica schnop. Then I found a great flock of southwest-facing cranes, and I guess they've got something that's wrong with their brains. For this kind of crane, when she's guarding her nest, will always stand facing precisely southwest. So, to get at those eggs wasn't hard in the least. I just came up from behind, from precisely northeast. And I captured the egg of the grickly gractus, who lays them up high on a prickly cactus. Then I went for the ziffs. They're exactly like the zuffs, but ziffs live on cliffs and zuffs live on bluffs. And seeing how bluffs are exactly like cliffs, it's mighty hard telling the zuffs from the ziffs. But I know that the egg that I got was from the bluffs, so if it wasn't a ziffs from the cliffs, then it was a zuffs. Now, I needed the egg from the moth-watching sneath, the moth-watching sneth, who's a bird who's so big it scares people to death. And this awful big bird, well, the reason they name her the moth-watching sneth is 'cause that's how they tame her. She likes watching moths, sort of quiets her mind, while she is watching you sneak up behind. And you just yank out her egg, so I got one, of course, with the help of some friends and a very fast horse. If you want to get eggs you can't buy at a store, you have to do things that you've never thought of before. Why, to get the egg of one very small boff, we had to pry all of one mountain top off. Then I heard of some birds who lay eggs, if you please, that taste like the air holes in Swiss cheese. And they live in big Zanzibar trees. So I ordered a treeful. The job was immense, but I needed those eggs and said, hang the expense. I still needed more, and I saved for the last the egg of the frightful bombastic aghast. And what bird is so mean? That bird is so fast that I had to escape on a Philippica jast. A fleet-forward beast who can run like a deer, but looks sort of different. You can steer him by ear. Although, with the searching, all through with the looking, I had all I needed, and now for the cooking. I rushed to the kitchen, the place where I'd stacked 'em, rolled up my sleeves, I unpacked 'em and cracked 'em. I shucked 'em and chucked 'em in 99 pans, and then I mixed up some beans. I used 55 cans. Then I mixed up some ginger, 9 prunes and 3 figs, and parsley quite sparsely, just 22 sprigs. Then I added 6 cinnamon sticks and a clove, and my scramble was ready to go onto the stove. And you know how they tasted? They tasted just like, well, they tasted exactly just like scrambled eggs super de duper de booper, special deluxe a la Peter T. Hooper.